Chair. I'm glad to be here tonight. We're at Florida Southern, and with people interested in learning more about economics and economic history, or interested in extra credit. Either way, I'm glad to talk with you about The Myth of the Robber Barons, the book that Derek mentioned, and a new book that I have out called Uncle Sam Can't Count. How many have heard this term, the robber barons, before? Referring to the people the businessmen who were responsible for the rise of the United States to being a world power. You know, I always thought that was odd when I wrote the book, The Myth of the Robber Barons, was dealing with the whole episode, because if you look at the United States, right about the time of the Civil War, we were a second-rate nation. In industry, we were behind England, we were behind Germany in chemicals, for example, we were behind England in such things as steel production. In rails, our first rails that we built in the United States had to be imported from England, and it wasn't until as late as 1848 that we built our first large-scale railroad, the Erie Railroad. And so we lagged way behind England. England had dominated steel production, as I said. If you look at oil production, although there the United States had some advantage at first, the deep, rich oil fields were north of Iran in Russia. And Russia was going to be the big competitor in the oil industry, so that it looked as though the United States, if you look at the United States after the Civil War, especially because of the devastation of the Civil War, not only in manpower, but our national debt rose more than it ever has proportionally in U.S. history. A 40-fold increase from $65 billion national debt to $2.7 billion. So this huge increase, and so that meant that the interest rate on the debt was twice as much as the debt itself. So in 1860, we have a $65 billion national debt. In 1865, we have an interest payment on the national debt that is almost $140 million. So here we are. We're not a candidate for success in the United States. Anybody observing would say, well, Britain will continue to grow and prosper. Russia has a lot of space out there, good oil industry, perhaps they will be the next industrial power. And then, of course, the Germans, they had the strongest chemical industry. And inventors, you know, they invented aspirin, were successful in bromine, and invented Novocaine. You get the chemical industry that's going to be so important in the 20th century. Invented in Germany. So you'd say, well, the powers, those will be the powers that will be dominant. Yet, by 1900, early 1900s, the United States was clearly the dominant economic power in the world. In steel, Andrew Carnegie, who would be the founder of Carnegie Steel, which was later U.S. Steel, started as the smallest steel producer in the United States in 1872. Britain dominated the world. By 1900, his company outproduced the entire nation of Great Britain. His company alone. One company, one American company, outproduced the entire nation of Great Britain. In oil, John D. Rockefeller, often referred to as a robber baron, he was the first billionaire in U.S. history. His company, Standard Oil Company, had a market share of 70%. And you're thinking, well, 70%, wow, that's pretty good. 70% of the world. Not the U.S., the world. 2 out of every 3 gallons of kerosene or gasoline sold in the world were sold by Standard Oil. We didn't have an import problem back then in oil, did we? It was other nations importing from us. The Russians were a distant, distant second place. Look at the advantage that gave Henry Ford at the beginning of the 1900s. To have his nation the #1 steel producer, the #1 oil producer. Ford will then pick up the industry that becomes the greatest industry of the first half of the 1900s, the auto industry, and he will be the dominant producer in the world. It is such a triumph of American ingenuity that, in American entrepreneurship, that I think the era could be, I think the generation that hit it could be described as the greatest generation. I think they at least have a claim to that title, which we give to the World War II generation. That generation that vaulted the United States into the dominant position would be the greatest generation. Now, that raises the question, why are they called robber barons? Well, one of the reasons, two quick reasons, is that the title was popularized by a man named Matthew Josephson, who was a journalist. He wrote a book called The Robber Barons, and some of you may have seen it, maybe even read it. Have some of you read it? Good, don't read it. Read The Myth of the Robber Baron. I don't mind if you read that book. I read it myself, The Robber Baron. But I want to say something about Josephson. It was written in 1934. When the book was published, Josephson, even though it was on the bestseller list for 6 months solidly after it was published, Josephson did it without even being there to promote the book. He was in Russia, where he sent back letters and cablegrams saying, "This is the future. This is the wonderful future." He called Stalin a statesman and described the wonderful life that he was witnessing in Russia. And when he came back, he said, "It's so hard to live in the United States where I feel culturally deprived and out of sync with the population. It was so much better back there in Russia." In other words, Matthew Josephson had an ideology, and these entrepreneurs who didn't like to use the government most of the time. I mean, Rockefeller wanted to produce the best oil he could at the cheapest price and never had a federal subsidy. Carnegie never had a federal subsidy. Occasionally, Carnegie had a tariff, but never a federal subsidy. That was anathema to Josephson. The government should have been involved. So that's point number one. Point number two is, we actually had some robber barons at the time. We actually had some people who I think that's a good name for them. They were the people who were seeking aid from the federal government. And getting it. And abusing it. I speak here of the Union Pacific Railroad. Yeah. Thomas Durant, others. Grenville Dodge at the Union Pacific Railroad, or the Central Pacific Railroad, where Leland Stanford was the man in charge. He named Stanford University after his son. Those people were receiving federal aid to build a transcontinental railroad. And I have a chapter on that, Myth of the Robber Barons, because I thought the story was so fantastic. You start out, let me get out here with you for a minute. The transcontinental, as many of you know, goes from Nebraska to California to connect the nation. We have railroads on the East Coast out to the Midwest, but we don't have them going from the Midwest out to the West. So we start out, and they said, well, we need subsidies to do this. So the Union Pacific was being paid $16,000 a mile, but it was being paid on rocky territory where it was mountainous, $48,000 a mile. And so they thought, they got together and thought, now wait a minute here, we're being paid by the mile. Okay, interesting. Interesting. So they're out there in Nebraska. Now we're here in Florida. It's cold in Nebraska, as in snow. They thought, if we're being paid by the mile, hey, let's go ahead. And they built the railroad on the ice. Well, when the ice melts, the ties, railroad ties, all of this is going to be a problem. It's not going to be, it's going to have to be rebuilt. Here's another point. They got the idea, we're paid by the mile to build a railroad by the federal government. So the railroad, it's going now east to west, right? East to west, through Nebraska. It began to look like this. Because the more curved it was, the more money they got. Even though that was a terribly inefficient way to build a railroad. Then when they got to the mountains, it was kind of up the mountain and down the mountain, because you don't want to lose time going on that flat mountain and going back to this again. When the two lines, both of which were paid by the federal government, they were supposed to meet. Well, here they are. They're coming. Well, first of all, they start getting close to each other. We had the invention of dynamite in the 1860s. The Union Pacific could have written a book called Dynamite, Its Uses and Abuses. One of the abuses, well, the use was to blow up a mountainous area and make it flat so you could get a flat grade. The abuse was when you went over and blew your competitor's railroad up. And so the Union Pacific did that, and then they said they didn't get completing those miles because they're gone now, so they don't get money for that, which means we're going to come over and build them instead. Well, here's one of those, I wonder what the Central Pacific did in response story. Aw, shucks, let's turn the other cheek. Or do they say, let's get dynamite of our own and blow their railroad up? So now we have the federal government giving subsidies to the railroads, which use the subsidy money to buy dynamite to blow up their competitors' railroad. Finally, Congress had to step in and say, no, nobody gets any more subsidies if you keep on using them this way. No more. So the two railroads, because they got stalled, because they were blowing up each other's track, they now are going to have to go, okay, here they come. And they parallel each other. Oh, claiming money for the mileage that they're paralleling. So then Congress has to get involved again and say, no, no, you're going to meet at Promontory Point in Utah. And that's that. Nobody gets any more money after that. We spent, remember I said the U.S. national debt was $65 million in 1860? During the 1860s, we spent almost $65 million, plus gave away free land just to do that. It was an incredible waste of money. And a lot of people said, well, I mean, the government had to do it, private enterprise wasn't able to do it. Except the private enterprise did do it. James J. Hill, an immigrant who only had one good eye. One of them was shot out with an arrow when he was a kid. A one-eyed immigrant comes along and builds a transcontinental railroad called the Great Northern. Today it's part of the Burlington Northern System. The Great Northern Railroad from St. Paul to Seattle. St. Paul, Minnesota, Seattle, Washington. No federal subsidies. It was a straight railroad. So why did you build a straight railroad, Mr. Hill? He says, because you don't make money when you build a railroad like this. Those are the railroads you want to compete against. A straight, efficient railroad. He went through the mountains. He even went back to the journals of Lewis and Clark to find out how you get through the Rocky Mountains with a flat grade. He found the Marias Pass, which Lewis and Clark used back in the early 1800s. Got a railroad to fit through that and went all the way to Seattle. The only transcontinental railroad never to go into bankruptcy and to show profits every year. The Union Pacific steadily went into bankruptcy and had to be resold again and again. The only one was privately funded. A fascinating story. I would say the Union Pacific qualified as robber barons in the Central Pacific. So what I'm saying is, number one, you have a person who had a real bias against entrepreneurs writing the history of the times. And then number two, you really did have some robber barons. In the book Myth of the Robber Barons, I separate the market entrepreneurs like Rockefeller and Mellon from what I call political entrepreneurs like the Union Pacific and Central Pacific, who are trying to succeed by using government money. The market entrepreneurs, the real entrepreneurs, were trying to produce a quality product at a competitive price. And they did so. When Rockefeller went into the oil business, it was about almost $1 a gallon for oil. He got it down to 8 cents a gallon. He was the original environmentalist. Save the whales, right? No more whale oil. Kerosene. Also, other people who used oil would dump the byproducts into the Cuyahoga River outside Cleveland. Rockefeller was a strong Christian, and he said, he spoke very softly to him, God doesn't make junk. So if God made that barrel of oil, there has to be a use for everything in that oil. We just have to have our chemists work to find out what it is. So he had a top-notch research and development department. We take that for granted in corporations today. It was very new when Rockefeller did it. And with that research and development, they found uses for all those byproducts. Well, you know, Vaseline and all sorts of waxes, naphtha, which you do for building roads and that sort of thing, and a variety of, as I say, of paint, even paint, wood they were able to get out of a byproduct of oil. And then he would sell the byproducts. His competitors were throwing the stuff into the river. So he'd just say, don't bother throwing it in the river. I'll just drop by and pick it up. And so Rockefeller was the best in the business because he was the best thinker and the most innovative mind. It's an exciting time in American history to think we were once second rate. Then, a generation later, we are the leading industrial power. Boy, is that going to come in handy come World War I, World War II. To be the leading industrial power. When you're producing the best oil and steel, and then you go into engines and cars, and we get developed jeeps and tanks, well, that's going to be fantastic. I want to use one more example, if I might, because I know a lot of you are thinking, well, the free market worked. Why would we ever veer off once we see the story of the transcontinentals? Why would we ever go back to thinking that we ought to involve the federal government? The answer is, after 1900, around 1900, we were told by those who wanted to involve the federal government that we had an urgent situation on our hands, that we had to get the government involved. And we said, a lot of people said, why? The response was, because Germany and France and England, all potential enemies of ours, are working on inventing an airplane. And they are subsidizing people to try to learn how to fly. And if they succeed, they're going to be able to have a group of people that can get on those airplanes, put bombs, and then come over here and drop them on us. Now, do you want to just let the market work this out in its own slow, good time? Or should we take the person who's the most knowledgeable, give them some funding, and invent this thing and continue our world leadership? That was the argument. If you think about it, there's almost an irresistible quality to that, especially when they went looking. Because, well, where can we find this person? And one came to the fore, Samuel Langley, who was the head of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. He had written a book called Experiments in Aerodynamics. He was considered a first-class scientist. He had inventions that he had done. He had honorary degrees from Harvard and Yale and Oxford and Cambridge. He sometimes had dinner at the White House. Members of the Senate and the House would wait in his antechamber in his office at the Smithsonian to talk with him about scientific issues. He had also, and this was the thing that swung in the subsidies into Langley's favor, he also had built I guess what we call today a model airplane. It was a little bigger than these, but it was unmanned. And he flew it there in D.C. around the Potomac River. And it stayed aloft for a minute or two. He had an engine on it. So the argument is that Langley is the most advanced scientist, at least in America, and that if we give him enough subsidy money to fly 2 flights, then he'll invent it. He said he would. He said, I will invent the airplane. The United States will continue the world leadership it established with Rockefeller, Carnegie, and others. I will continue the next phase. But in this case, it needs a federal subsidy. We did it. Langley began building his airplane. And if you were to see it, the thing, it reflects a theory of flight that he had. I know, when you think of an airplane, you think of a runway. He had his airplane on a houseboat in the middle of the Potomac. Now, I know that seems odd to us today, but he made it sound sensible at the time. What he said was this. He said, I have a theory of flight. And the theory of flight is that you need to take this airplane and pull it back with a rubber band-like device on this houseboat in the Potomac. Pull it back, and then let it fly into the air. And he said, then you have your engines going, you have your pilot. And he said, then the engines and the pilot will keep it aloft once it is there. He liked to use this analogy when people asked him more about it. He said this, it's like an ice skater. He said, and of course we don't know about that in Florida very much, but the ice skater floats along the ice, and if the ice is a little bit thin, if he stops, he'll fall in. But he won't fall in as long as he's on the ice because his weight is not all there. He said the same principle applies, Langley said, to flight. And that's why you use this catapult device to launch the flight. Then it stays in the air, and that's when you're chugging and the engine is going, and you direct it at that point. Langley spoke to reporters. It was a major issue in Washington, D.C. And finally, Langley was ready for his first flight. His pilot got in. This was strictly Ivy League. The pilot was from Cornell. You know, this was all that Langley was going to do. He had the pilot in. They pulled the big rubber band device back, and it flew in the air. And the pilot said, to be aloft is wonderful. It was less wonderful when he crashed right into the water. And it's interesting, in the book that I do, Uncle Sam Can't Count, I was quoting a little bit from the Langley, well, I'll put it in quotes, the flight. Because most people said it didn't look as though it advanced even 1 centimeter, other than the force of the catapult and then down into the ground. The Washington Post commented on this flight. Again, flight in quotation marks. They did it in 13 words. 13 words. These are the 13 words they used. Any stout boy of 15 could have skimmed an oyster shell much further. Any stout boy of 15 could have skimmed an oyster shell much further. Langley, however, was not to be deterred. He said, "I am in no way affected by this accident. It is one of a large chapter of accidents that beset the initial stages of experiments, so novel as the present ones." Well, he's not worried. We're ready for flight number 2. Flight number 2. Again, the rubber band-like device, the plane, it flies up into the air. It's launched. It crashes down again. The Boston Herald, which sent reporters there to watch this experiment, said, "Professor Langley ought to give up on flying machines and try his hand at submarines." The New York Times said it's going to take engineers and mathematicians a long time to figure out how to fly. Perhaps 1 million years. The New York Times was inaccurate in its estimate. Inaccurate by 999,999 years and 356 days. 9 days after Langley's second flight failed, the Wright brothers, 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, with $1,500 of their own money, flew the first manned aircraft in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They said when they were asked about it, "We didn't accept Langley's theory. What we thought was important, we watched birds and we believed that the nature of the wing was important, the curvature of the wing." And they said, "We practiced on gliders for 3 years." In other words, they get on a high hill there at Kitty Hawk. They were from Ohio, but they practiced in Kitty Hawk because there were wind patterns and hills. And they'd get on a hill with that glider, and then the glider would go, and they'd fall. And they hoped they wouldn't get hurt too much, but they would practice trying to figure out how to make the plane move, how to turn it. And they worked through that, and only at the very end did they put the engine on. See, Langley put the engine on right away and said that was the key to the whole thing. The Wright brothers thought, you've got to figure out how to maneuver it. And they even had, when they would fly the plane, they would sit on the plane in a prone position, and their hands and feet would be guiding levers like the rudder they had with the feet, and they'd be making curvature so that they could kind of direct the plane a little bit. 9 days after landing, the Wright brothers succeeded with no federal aid whatsoever. What's interesting, again, is to look at how the federal aid misdirects incentives. Once you get the federal aid, you don't really have an incentive, or at least that strong an incentive, to really be good. You have an incentive to keep trying to get the aid. For example, after the Wright brothers finally succeeded, they came to the government and offered their, what was called the Wright Flyer to the government, their airplane, the Wright Flyer, for $25,000. In today's money, that would be over $500,000, which at the time was a lot. But I mean, it flew. By the time they were offering it to the government, it could fly for 5–10 minutes. They figured we have to get it at least flying that long to have it be militarily a threat. The government turned them down. The Wright brothers said, well, we've just got to get this thing so it flies for an hour. And they worked on it, and they got it so it flew for an hour, and they came back to the government and offered it again later. There were two other offers on the table. One was from Langley, who said, give me another subsidy, and I'll show you how to do it right. I think it's interesting because one of Langley's supporters said something kind of interesting, which I thought was, I mean, when you look at the nature of funding, listen to this argument. To turn Langley down would be to confess that the War Department did not know what it was about in providing funds in the first place. Isn't that clever? In other words, you've got to fund him in order to make your first part of your investment make any sense. You admit you've wasted it unless you try them a third time. We had another competitor on the scene. The French. They offered to sell the United States a big balloon. Like, only it wasn't helium, it was hydrogen at the time. A big, huge balloon. They said, look, forget this airplane stuff. This big balloon goes in the air, you float over, and then you drop the bombs over people. So the U.S. government said, we're going to do something. We're going to make a move. And they had three choices. They could buy the Wright Flyer, they could give Langley a third subsidy, or they could buy the balloon. Put yourself in the position of the War Department. I have a question for you. Which one do you think they used? Think about it. Let me take a vote. That's what we do in America, though. We take votes. Sometimes. Let's have a vote. How many of you think, now you have three choices. They fund Langley, they fund the Wright brothers, or they buy a balloon. How many think they bought the Wright brothers airplane? One? You're a very lonely vote. Two? What a cynical audience. You don't, only two people in this crowd think they bought the Wright Flyer. Okay, how many of you think, so Wrights get 2 votes, how many think they funded Langley for another subsidy? Oh my goodness. This is huge. I see people at the back, I wasn't even sure they were in the room. Okay, that's huge. How many think they bought a balloon? Okay, a small, modest number. Overwhelmingly, you people think they gave Langley another subsidy. And in this case, the majority. Is wrong. They bought the balloon. And that gives us another reason why the federal government subsidies go on. It's hard to know what to pick. They bought the balloon because they thought that's what looked at the time like the best should have made the government suspicious was that the French, after selling us the balloon, and we bought it,
On the right flag.
invited the Wright brothers over to France to test the Wright flyer with offers to buy should it show itself able to work. Wilbur Wright went over to Paris. And I mean, he had to dismantle the Wright flyer and then ship it overseas on a ship and then reconstruct the whole thing over in France. He did it. And he flew for over an hour over Paris. He went into the countryside and he said, I looked down and there'd be people, I mean, in disbelief. And he was just shouted. And I mean, when he finally landed, he was almost mobbed with people. They were so excited. The French wanted to buy it. At that point, the government said, no, us first. And so we did sell it to Americans first. But the French would get a chance to get into the game through that. Because they did buy a Wright flyer. But it indicates again, when the market is involved, the techniques that work tend to be the ones that survive and prosper. Like the Wright brothers' theory of flight with the glider and not going heavy on the engine first. And you get the correct things working. Once you give subsidies, you could just be going down a bad path. See, Langley, I want to make something clear. After the Wright brothers flew, Langley said, oh, it was just a fluke. I really have the right recipe. If the Wright brothers hadn't come in there and shown us how to do it, we would have for a long time had people investing. Well, what we need is a bigger engine. See, the thing could have just been going on indefinitely. With the markets, you get to see what works, what doesn't. Consumers will choose, and we ended up having a very successful Wright flyer. Now, all of this, I say, and let me put in some finishing touches here, and I want to open it up for questions. This has relevance. I hope you see the relevance today for public policy. Part of this is a history, and I mean, it's almost embarrassing because the subtitle of the sequel book to Myth of the Robber Barons is Uncle Sam Can't Count. The subtitle is A History of Failed Government Investments from Beaver Pelts to Green Energy. It goes from George Washington to Barack Obama. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say the opening chapter is on a subsidy that George Washington wanted that totally failed, to the fur trade. And so what we have is an instinct, often by government officials, and I think you can see this because they're in government. And by the way, I think Washington was a great president. That was an error, but I think he was a great president. But that decision, it sort of reflects the knee-jerk, oh, if we want to get something, give somebody a subsidy, and then they'll get it for us. But it didn't work that way with a good transcontinental railroad, and it didn't work that way in inventing the airplane. Sometimes the subsidies actually seem to stall progress, and it's only when we open up the markets do we really get the good economic progress. It's wonderful that the United States was able to continue its prosperity through the invention of the airplane and through the railroad. When it comes to oil, I have a section at the end, and I just want to say a couple of things about that, because I want to get it into a more modern an issue. Some of you may remember the old timers amongst us here. When we had in the 1970s, when we had the oil energy crisis. And how many remember the long gas lines? Yeah. Yeah, we're not going to sit here with the young ones and say, oh, we had it rough and you guys had it cushion. I'm not going to get into that. I'm off it right now. But I just want to say that we did have a spur in the price of oil. Jimmy Carter gave a speech, and the problem, Nixon, Ford, and Carter all went down the wrong track, Republican and Democrat alike. And Carter, for example, when he was involved in this, he made a speech right when he became president. He said, "The oil shortage is permanent. I'm reading Carter now. The greatest challenge our country will face during our lifetimes is the oil crisis. and it is likely to get progressively worse. We could use up all the proven reserves of oil in the entire world by the end of the next decade. It's the 1980s. What we're putting in a gas tank? I don't know. He says sometime in the 1980s, we are going to run out. We can't create any more. Demand will overtake production. We have no choice about that. Why? We can't substantially increase our domestic production. It is fixed and it is running out. So if it's running out and it's fixed, we need to have, entrepreneurs can't solve it. Government's got to solve it by rationing what we have and encouraging investments in ethanol and alternate fuels. The ethanol became a huge receiver of federal subsidies. In the last, President Bush's last term and in President Obama's first term, the amount of subsidies that went to ethanol and to wind power was $200. I don't even think, well, it's only $200. That's not so bad. Okay. $200 a second. Every second for 8 years. In a subsidy. And that is 30 years after the oil energy crisis because we said we're running out. I just want to say, entrepreneurs solve problems. It's often government, unfortunately, creates them, and the entrepreneurs can bail us out. George Mitchell, in the 1980s, when President Reagan came in, Reagan said, end of price controls on oil, we're going to free up drilling. George Mitchell began to experiment with hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling. He was doing this in Texas. He experimented with $400 million of his own money over 17 years. Other people had done fracking on a smaller scale. He didn't invent it. But it's like Henry Ford didn't invent the assembly line, but he's the one who really made it work. And it's the same here with George Mitchell. He really made the fracking work. And so much so that we have enough natural gas in North Dakota and the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, and then the Eagle Ford in Texas. So you have the Bakken in North Dakota, Marcellus in Pennsylvania, Eagle Ford in Texas. We have enough natural gas to supply us for the next 250 years and enough oil for generations. I haven't heard it. They just say for generations, however long that is. Entrepreneurs and markets have been wonderful to the United States and so consistent with the Constitution. I just think the story needs to be told. That's why I tell it, the myth of the robber barons and the other book. I think if we don't know these stories, and I'm not saying this is the only view one can have, I'm saying let's inform what decisions we make with looking at the historical record when we talk about public policy and government subsidies. Look at the historical record. Then after we've done that, let's make decisions on what ought to be done. In the past, when we've trusted markets and trusted entrepreneurs, we've been very successful. When we've tended to go the subsidy route, whether the transcontinental railroads, Langley in the airplane, or the ethanol subsidies in modern times, we've tended to either have it be unproductive or in some cases actually counterproductive, making us worse off than when we started. Thank you.